Caffeine is a very interesting compound in relationship to sleep and wake. Obviously, everyone knows that caffeine can help you stay awake. It's no coincidence that those two words that you've used about these chemical compounds, caffeine and adenosine, sound the same. It's because the receptor or the receptor systems that caffeine targets in your brain are the adenosine receptors. And you think, well, Matt was telling me that the more adenosine that builds up, in other words, the more adenosine that's latching onto those adenosine receptors in your brain, the sleepier that you feel. And I'm telling you that caffeine works on those same receptors. That doesn't make sense. Caffeine, if it's working on those same receptors, should increase your sleepiness. It doesn't, because when it binds onto those adenosine receptors, those welcome sites in the brain, it simply blocks them. It doesn't deactivate them, nor does it activate them. It simply blocks them. So think about it almost a little bit like a room that's full of chairs. And at some point, these adenosine, which is one collection of people with the name badges of adenosine, they would normally like to come in and start sitting down on those seats, which are the adenosine receptors. And as they sit down on those seats, you're building up this signal of sleepiness. Well, caffeine, which is another group of people with caffeine badges, they race into the room and they start to hijack the seats and they start to sit down on them. And all of a sudden, adenosine can't find any seats to sit on. So your brain is still flooding that room with adenosine. So the adenosine is still building up. But the reason that you don't feel sleepy anymore when you've had a shot of caffeine is because caffeine has raced in, it's latched onto the receptors, and it has essentially hit the mute button on your sleepiness. So now your brain was thinking, gosh, I've been awake for about 13 or 14 hours. I'm starting to feel it. I'm just going to take a quick espresso shot. And you get that. You think, well, hang on a second. 20, 30 minutes later, I don't feel as tired anymore. Why? It's not because caffeine came in and removed the adenosine. It didn't. Caffeine has come in, blocked the sites, but the adenosine is still building up. And then at some point, the caffeine wears off. And therefore, not only do you go back to the same level of adenosine that you did 2 hours ago, it's that plus the additional 2 hours of adenosine that has been building up. And what you experience is something called a caffeine crash. And now you need even more caffeine, not just to get you back to where you were, but to recover the crash that you've had and go further. The contradiction, however, was that I was telling people caffeine, not good for your sleep, and sleep, by the way, is wonderful for health. It transacts all of these benefits that we have and will discuss in this series. But then you compare that relative to caffeine, and caffeine transacts many of the same health benefits. So how can you explain that, Mr. Sleep Scientist? Well, if you look, the data is very clear. It's not the caffeine that's the benefit. Most people take on board caffeine by way of a cup of coffee. And the coffee bean is packed full not just of caffeine, it contains a whopping dose of antioxidants. And because of our deficient Western diets, we're so absent of these antioxidants that the humble cup of coffee has been asked to carry the Herculean weight of our antioxidant needs on its shoulders. So no wonder it by itself carries such a strong health signal, because it's providing you with this wonderful dose of antioxidants in addition to caffeine. Case in point, if you look at decaffeinated coffee, you still get the antioxidants, but now you don't get the caffeine, and lo and behold, you get many of the same health benefits. It's not the caffeine, it's the coffee itself. So I think that is a perfectly good reason to justify caffeine. But again, just like naps, the dose and the timing make the poison. If you're not someone who's sensitive to caffeine, then having a couple of cups of caffeine and trying to step away from the use of caffeine, I would argue somewhere between 10 to 12 hours before you expect to go to bed, depending on your sensitivity. And it is different across people, and we know that it's genetic. There is a specific, what we call a polymorphism, which just means a variation in a particular gene. And if you look at variations in that, it will predict whether you are someone who is very sensitive to caffeine or not very sensitive to caffeine. And it comes down to how quickly you can essentially metabolically remove that caffeine from the system. So if you know that you're a very sensitive person, I would probably argue try to steer clear maybe 12 to 14 hours. If you're someone who is not as sensitive, then you could maybe go to 8 hours. The danger is for people who say, look, I'm one of those people who is, really just not sensitive to caffeine at all. And I can have an espresso with dinner and I fall asleep fine. I stay asleep fine. So it's really not a problem for me. I would say that may be true, but the inherent danger here is that when we've done these studies, if I give you a dose of, let's say, 200, 300, 400 milligrams of caffeine in the hours before bed, which would be a large, strong cup of coffee or, 2 espressos with dinner, some people can fall asleep and some people stay asleep. But the amount of deep sleep that they have is compromised. In fact, it can drop your deep sleep by up to 20%. Now, the danger is that you wake up in the morning and there was no signals in your sleep that said you had problematic sleep because you're not aware of how much deep sleep that you had. That's the reason that I think, sleep trackers can be helpful in some ways. But you then wake up and you don't feel as refreshed and restored, but you don't remember having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. But now you find yourself reaching for 3 cups of coffee to wake up in the morning rather than the standard 2. And so goes the vicious cycle. So, and also you see an interesting interrelationship. We did a recent study we just published in Wall Street Traders. It's not just caffeine use, it's also about alcohol use in the evening. That people who over-medicate with caffeine during the day, they then need something to bring them down at night. And the principal depressant agent, and depressant not in the sense of psychiatric depression, but in the sense of brain neural activity depression, is alcohol. So you get this classic cycle of uppers and downers. I need my uppers during the morning, my caffeine, and I need my downers at night to lull me into sleep. And it's this really interesting trade-off, which we saw in these Wall Street traders. So coming back to the notion of caffeine, though, I am favorable of it in terms of its health benefits. I think it's very, very clear. Just be mindful of the dose and be mindful of the timing. Dose, try to not exceed about 3 cups of coffee. Timing, understand your sensitivity. There are certain genetic tests, if you really want to get nerdy, that will tell you if you have this sensitivity or not, but you will probably know it. And therefore just say, okay, I'm not that sensitive. I could probably go 8 hours or as close as 8 hours before sleep, or 10 hours. If you're very sensitive, 14, 15 hours, and keep it to 1 cup. So those are the ways that I would see moderating caffeine and changing my mind on caffeine, which just comes back to your point where you were saying, look, I made this recommendation about caffeine. I want to make sure I modify that so people don't get confused. I certainly needed to make a modification to my stance on caffeine. So thank you for letting me say that, which is a long-winded